just want to get right into it. Kickoff tomorrow in Stanford Stadium. I want to go back to last week to see which performance was more real, right? Stanford won 35 or lost 35-14. Colorado held on for a 48-42 win. Which one do you expect to be more predictive of what we'll see going forward?
I think that's a tough question. I think that the Colorado win is more real, so to speak, simply because I think the fact that David Mills was scratched from the roster so last minute for the Cardinal due to the positive coronavirus test. That obviously threw a massive wrench in David Shaw's plan and the Cardinals' plan from an offensive perspective versus everything actually went pretty smoothly with the Buffs versus the Bruins. Knock on wood that things remain the same, from between now and 12:30 Pacific time tomorrow. So I think that in terms of what was a sort of more indicative performance in terms of what we're likely to see down the road, should all things remain stable, which obviously sort of, we can't be sure of anything given these times. I think that we can probably rely on the Buffs' performance as a more sort of quality picture and sort of more holistic picture of what, we're likely to see coming down the road. But how about yourself?
I definitely thought from Stanford's offense, we didn't have a good idea at all. I think Jack West and Tanner McKee, the two quarterbacks that filled in, did an admirable job. They stepped in, but not providing what Davis Mills would have. The coaches were so excited about Davis Mills and those receivers, and we didn't really get to see it get off the ground. I do think, and we'll get into this a little bit later, that Stanford's rushing game, what they showed in the first game, was very real and should be expected. But at the same time, I do think what Stanford's defense showed that was really just porous was what we should expect going forward as well. Oregon, especially on the ground, tore through Stanford, and it didn't look good in the air either. I think Stanford really struggled there, and I think that should be expected. But then looking over at Colorado, the defense, I think, is going to be a team that gives up around a lot of points, right? Last year, it was around 35 points per game. That really saved them last week is the 4 turnovers, but I don't know if that's anything that has to do with the Colorado's defense necessarily, or just that UCLA was coughing up so many turnovers and DTR, and just a lot of struggles there. So I don't know if Colorado can keep that up going forward. They had 11 interceptions and 6 fumble recoveries last year. They already had 1 interception and 3 fumble recoveries this year. So that's a lot to ask of anybody. But what you said earlier with Jarek Broussard, Sam Neuer, that's going to keep on rolling for Colorado. I have no reason to see that stopping, especially, as I said, Stanford's defense looks like it's going to struggle, and I see that they can have another game.
Yeah, I agree with you regarding sort of the Stanford defense, was a little bit porous, is a little bit less experienced, and they had a lot of young guys sort of forced to just kind of grow. David Shaw was sort of quoted as saying that they were there's a lot of guys on the defensive side of the ball that sort of had to grow immediately into, playing, just like being fully relied upon without any kind of full summer camp. And, there is no preseason, obviously, in college football and stuff. And so there's a lot of guys who just sort of had to, there were young guys needing to fill in some spots, and they were relied upon sort of right off the bat. And so I think that obviously that's a little bit of a hindrance for Stanford. I think that on the defensive side of the ball for Colorado, we can be somewhat, we can expect to see more strong defensive play because of, between the defense and the offense for Colorado, the defense certainly has more strong returning players, particularly with Mustafa Johnson, as a very, very strong edge rusher, as well as Nate Landman, inside linebacker, who has sort of been, had that big 4th and 1 stop for Colorado that sort of ended up really sort of sealing the game for them against UCLA. And so I think that Colorado is going to rely on sort of defensive stalwarts like that. I think that while, it was really great to see Jarek Broussard and Sam Neuer have a really good game last week, the same could be said in terms of UCLA. We don't know whether they sort of just had a fluky, decent offensive game, or whether their offense is actually sort of like whether their offense will continue to put up numbers like they did today or not. And so I think that it's likely that Colorado's defense is going to continue to be what honestly is more reliable to keep them in games than their offense.
Yeah, and last year I know Stanford came into that game expecting a lot from their offense going against Colorado, just because Colorado in its first 9 games had given up 30 points every single time. Stanford goes out and scores 13. So that's to say that Colorado's defense can absolutely step up at any time. And I look at Sam Neuer, and I think he had about 64 rushing yards last game. Really stood out to me just because Stanford has struggled so much with running quarterbacks going back to last year, and then even last week with Tyler Shugg just demolishing them on the ground. So that's something that I could really see continuing because Stanford has just been so awful with that. But yeah, UCLA's defense, I don't know how much of a test they really provided just because they've had a lot of struggle. I don't trust Chip Kelly with anything right now. So that, I don't know if that's a real bellwether for what the rest of the year could look like.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you make a good point there, right? Is that, Chip Kelly and, versus the Buffs compared to this, the Cardinal playing a now number 11 ranked nationally team in the Oregon Ducks. I think that that's something to take into account when we're sort of making this comparison, right? It's because Oregon's obviously proven to be a team that, should they continue to sort of have the season that they, that their ranking indicates that they could have, and that, they, displayed is potentially possible against Stanford, that if there's any Pac-12 team that makes it into the college football playoff at the end of the day, they're setting themselves up nicely to be that team over USC, over Arizona State, probably the 2 next sort of closest teams in terms of just overall strength in the Pac-12. And so I think that that's something, we also have to consider in terms of the Stanford defense looking a little bit porous, as you mentioned. And in addition, the Colorado offense looking as strong as it did, and we could honestly be in for a much sort of closer game than Stanford's loss and Colorado's win might otherwise indicate. And I think that similar to last year, we could come right down to sort of a last minute field goal or something like that. Particularly because both of these teams are very young, and so I think that will continue to show itself a little bit. And one game, really isn't experienced, so to speak, for either team to really be able to, rely upon going forward.
Yeah, that point is really huge. I think Stanford is the 4th youngest team in FBS in terms of the number of underclassmen they have. And Oregon was first, and that's what I was most looking forward to, is that I thought Stanford's defensive line could really take advantage of all the inexperience of Oregon's offensive line. They had just 6 returning starts, and I think what demoralizing a little bit is that Stanford's defensive line wasn't able to take advantage of that at all. So that's something that really stood out to me. But yeah, you're totally right with everything around the conference, that Stanford was going up against one of the better teams nationally, better teams in the conference, and it's hard to read too much into it just because of the situation there. And I want to address. They're asking us for some final score predictions. I think we can get to that later. What do you feel about that?
I think we're likely to get to it, later, toward the end of the show. But I would say that I expect to see, if I had to guess, I would expect to see a relatively low scoring game and something along the lines of, perhaps, a 17-14 win. I think that Colorado could pull it off given the game that they had last week, and given the fact that, Davis Mills returning is unlikely for tomorrow and stuff. But as you said, Jack West and Tanner McKee both, displayed a lot of strength sort of in having to just step up into that role pretty in an impromptu way. But I think that we're likely to see a lot of turnovers. I think we're likely, with these 2 young teams, I think we're likely to see a somewhat sort of sloppy game and sort of a, just like a lot of 3 and outs, a lot of defense played by both teams. And, making it, ultimately not necessarily the most exciting game to see from a scoring perspective, but could be exciting toward the end of the game, just because I think that those kind of things tend to even each other out. in terms of it ultimately turning into a very sort of close matchup. But how about yourself?
And then absolutely on that,